All right, AP World History students. So today is January 29th, 2019. So just want to go over a couple of things that we're going to cover today. First thing you want to do is make sure you take out your notes. This is going to be a continuation of chapter 14. You also want to make sure that you go ahead and take out your key concept questions. So both those things I passed out to you guys earlier this week, we're going to make sure that we cover, I'd say close to about 90% of those key concept questions. The first thing we're going to go ahead and cover in our notes is specifically the question of describe the movements of goods, wealth, free and unfree laborers that was part of the early modern trade. So in doing so, what you need to be able to make sure that you do is you describe the transatlantic slave trade. You want to make sure that you're able to answer these questions. Sorry for the typo. It should say A, B, C, D. But what had slavery been like before the transatlantic slave trade? What were the reasons for it? As well as, more importantly, how did it go ahead and play a role in terms of the social structure, gender roles, and culture in both Africa and the nations that were involved within it. At the very end, this being a close to a 2-hour course today, in terms of time, one of the things that you will be required to do is specifically to complete a DBQ on the transatlantic slave trade. You'll have to create a thesis, use the documents, and of course doing the HIP analysis. All of this will be done in class. Homework for tonight, you're looking at chapter 14 and 15 note cards, questions, as well as the map. There is tutoring available tomorrow for chapter 14 and 15, as well as a chance for you to redo your introduction and thesis on what was due on Monday. There will be a new prompt that's addressed. So moving forward, a couple things I want you to look at is this is an example of a well-written thesis, as well as intro for our last prompt. The prompt was, in what ways are trading post empires similar and different to the empires established in the Americas? I highly recommend that you write that prompt at the top of the page. Reason being is when you tie this back in your thesis needs to make sure that it is addressing all components of the prompt. So in order to score all the points, I need to make sure that you are mentioning the Americas and as well as the trading post empires. You also need to make sure that you're mentioning similarities and differences. If those things are not present, you will not earn the full points. What this student went ahead and did that was very well was I could see with these check marks right here that they're providing me the context, the whole big picture. And they went ahead and they mentioned the 3Gs in terms of explorations for the Americas. They've also mentioned the monopolization and the spice trade when you're looking at the importance of this in the East India Trade Company. So they did get the context points. What I also really did like about their essay was that you could see that the thesis was in the towards the end, and it was specific and it was clear. And it starts here. All in all, trading post-empires and empires established in the Americas are similar in the aspect that both wanted to have some sort of economic gain to come out of the empires, but they are different in the aspect of trading post-empires, so they wanted economic, and while the Americas wanted to spread religion. So you're looking at this. This is very specific. Good context and specific. All right. This did earn the points on the rubric. Okay. So make sure that you kind of use this as an example. So moving forward, before we get to the transatlantic slave trade, I want to make sure that I covered specifically what was a Japanese shogunate. This was an aspect that was in chapter 14, and one of the questions that you're required to answer was specifically how the nobility or how the elite wealthy class in some ways influenced the monarchy or the emperor. So when you're looking at the slide, here are a couple things that you want to make sure you understand. First and foremost, you need to be able to make sure that you understand the structure of the Japanese during the early modern era. At the very top, you're going to have the emperor, right? Right underneath the emperor, you're going to go ahead and have the daimyo, which were the wealthy landowners. This is very similar to feudalism in Europe. Remember, where you would have the monarch and then you typically had the nobility right under, right? One thing that you want to be clear, though, is you actually had the shogun, which was, in some ways, I guess you could be considered as more like a warrior class that, in many ways, actually had much of the rights to rule, right? The emperor was pretty much just more of a symbolism of the power of Japan, of cultural traditions, rather than actually having the legislative, judicial, and executive power to run the state. Right underneath them, you'd have the samurai warriors. So very similar to feudalism, where remember you would have the nobility, then you would have the knights that would go ahead and protect the nobility, right? Then last but not least, you'd have the largest class, and you'd have the merchant class. The merchant class it's important to remember that they were seen as a lower class simply because they relied on trade, which meant that they did not produce anything on their own. They relied on the success of others. All right. So moving forward, a couple things that you want to understand, about this was that in the 16th century, that Japan was experiencing a lot of feudal warfare between the daimyo and the wealthy landowners. This was specifically important because that the shogunate, which is the actual ruler of Japan, did not necessarily have a stronghold on Japan. With this in mind, you're getting a lot of European influence coming in. This is a good market for European military technology, shipbuilding skills, geographic knowledge, commercial opportunities, and as well as religious ideas. In fact, you're getting close to 300,000 converts in the late 16th century. So religion and religion and Christianity was spreading prominently in Japan. However, by the 17th century, what you want to understand was that the shogun, the supreme military commander, wanted to establish more control. In fact, they wanted to go ahead and take I guess you could say, a trend back to traditional custom. So with that in mind, they saw Europeans as a threat. They actually went ahead and kicked out all the Christian missionaries and violently suppressed those that practiced Christianity. You're looking at thousands of Japanese converts that were either exiled or they were killed, with more than 62 missionaries being killed. What you also want to understand about this is all European trade was completely gone, with the exception of the Dutch. And the reason why the Dutch weren't just taken out was, remember, that the Dutch did not want to spread religion. They were in there specifically for monetary gain, right? So that's the reason why. So with that in mind, Japan would be closed off all the way up until the late 1800s, right? And this would be very important because Japan would have to play a whole bunch of catching up to the European nation in terms of industrialization and technology, which would in some ways set the precursor to World War I and World War II. So all in all, you should be able to answer specifically how this led to, in some ways, just a change. The shogunate led to a change within Japanese society from 16th to 17th century. All in all, you're looking at a lack of European involvement. So the next essential question we have to look at is, what had slavery been like before the Transatlantic Slave Trade? This is something that will show up in the AP World History exam. You do not want to kind of just see slavery in the early modern era. Remember, it did exist. So a couple things that you want to understand just looking at this map. First and foremost, you want to look at the trade patterns. Okay, so looking at these trade patterns, we could see here that before the 1500s, much of the trade within our society existed within the Mediterranean as well as the Indian Ocean. Okay, the Mediterranean and ocean basins were typically the major source of trade. The trans-Saharan slave trade funneled slaves into the Mediterranean, as well as East Africans bringing trade within the Middle East. So what you want to understand is, remember, we're looking at trans-Saharan, so trade all across Africa. And what you're noticing is you're getting slaves that are being sent from West Africa to the Mediterranean. At the same time, one of the things you're also getting is you're getting East Africans, southern, southeast, or more of Central East Africans that are also being sent into the Middle East. When we're looking at the trade in the Middle East, one of the things that we want to understand is that this was different from the transatlantic slave trade. In fact, with Indian Ocean trade, sometimes slaves went ahead and assimilated into society, right? Remember, typically with American trade or the transatlantic trade, that is something that necessarily didn't happen. It happened more in the South, but definitely not in North America. Another difference that you want to understand is that just between the transatlantic trade as well as the trade within the Islamic world is that typically with the transatlantic trade, one of the things we'll touch on is that it was more male slaves, right? On the flip side, when you're looking at the Islamic world before the 1500s, most of these were typically female slaves. The cause of slavery during this time was also sugar, right? There was a lot of sugar plantations that were actually developed and found in West Africa. and also within the Mediterranean. So that was typically the reason why. And the reason why the sugar trade established, or would later be influenced within the early modern era, right, was that the Europeans would learn the sugar plantation specifically from the Muslims that were within this area. In fact, the Pope in 1452 actually gave full permission to the Christians, and the book quotes, full and free permission to invade, search out, capture, and subjugate Muslims and pagans and any non-believers. So what this is kind of telling us is there are two motives for slaves before the early modern era, or slavery. Number one, leading to the early modern era, I apologize, is that sugar plantations, sugar was becoming a hot commodity, but as well as religion in some ways allowed it for it to happen, right? Uh, the, the question comes up is why specifically, when we were looking at the Americas, why did the Americas typically want slaves from Africa? Well, coming back to this argument is, remember, there's been a historical experience of using slaves in Africa for the sugar plantations in near the Mediterranean as well as West Africa, but as well as there was a lot of racism that was involved. There are several Muslim texts that were mentioned that kind of looked at Africans and referring them as blacks as strong slaves, or slaves that were typically didn't necessarily fight back and were obedient, right? And this was prominent in both European as well as Muslim text. Right. So to sum it up, slavery did exist, mostly in Mediterranean and West Africa as well as Central, and those trade routes up to the Mediterranean as well as through trans-Saharan Africa were definitely impacted by the sugar trade, or not sugar trade, but sorry, by the sugar plantations. So what were the reasons for the use of coerced labor? A couple things that you want to look at is the high demand for slave labor was sugar trade in South America, right? Remember, there's a high demand for slave labor specifically because of the Great Dying, right? They typically needed some of the slaves from West Africa to come over as a result of the male population that was dying as a result of disease, right? In fact, first, one of the things that we're looking at in terms of this first bullet is Portugal first reported that Africans could not defend themselves, right? So when we're looking at the Portuguese really going ahead and taking charge of the trade early on, right? Looking at this too is that Europeans, when they first involved themselves in this trade, they typically stayed on the coast. Much of the trade was simply in the hands of Africans as well, right? That the Portuguese as well as other Europeans refused to go in terms of Central Africa simply because they weren't immune to those diseases. The Africans typically were willing to trade slaves for guns, manufactured goods, as well as cowrie shells. These cowrie shells were from America, and they were used as currency. So this is, in a way, where you're first seeing some of the trends of full-on global trade, right? And this is kind of what I'm hitting here, is Europeans exploit African rivalries in order to get slaves at the lowest cost. How? Well, you typically had manufactured goods. And remember, during this time in Africa, there was no African unity. You're simply getting just many tribes, many kingdoms, and these slaves were sold as they were originally prisoners of war, right? So to sum it up, main reason, high demand for labor because of the Great Dying in the Americas, as well as in Africa, there was a demand for manufactured goods, right? And they were willing to sell prisoners of war at a low cost. Trends that you want to understand is that Portugal is definitely the most prominent slave trader, right? In fact, most of the slaves were going to the South America, and I want you to consider why is it that we tend to believe that most slaves actually went up north, which is false, right? There's a better view of that map. Two examples that your text goes over in terms of slave kingdoms would be Asante and Dahomey. Right, these were two major empires that they rose to prominence during the silver trade, or the gold during the slave trade. I'm sorry. Asante was more dominant on the Gold Coast, while you could see Dahomey, which was able to obtain 1 million slaves. One thing you want to understand, though, is once again that these slaves were typically prisoners of war. And remember, this was their choice. It was these kingdoms' choice to engage in the trade. So, for example, Benin, they weren't prominent in the trade at all. In fact, they chose to stay completely isolated and not involved in it. So looking at this, One of the things that this shows is typically those that were involved in trade. A common misconception is that Britain, as well as North America, British North America, were heavily involved in it. I mean, they definitely were. We're not going to downplay the elements of the slave trade there, but it's nowhere near compared to Portugal, right? And remember, the uh, British and North American colonialism, you were getting families that were moving in, right? On the other hand, you didn't necessarily have, I mean, although you had a lot of the Native American population dying in North America, it was nowhere near the extent of that of the Portuguese in Spain. They need to bring in that labor to work the sugar plantations as a result of the imbalance of the population, right? You're typically getting with Portugal and Spain only men migrating versus Britain, where it was whole families, right? Other things that we want to really look at is what do we know about the voyage to the Americas? Your text typically talks about just the amount of deaths, right? When we're looking at this, I mean, you're getting close to 10 to 14% numbers show of the Middle Passage of Africans that were actually not able to make it, right? Um, you're also getting a lot of rebellions that were taking place. So you really want to make sure that you understand just typically what that Middle Passage was and what that voyage entailed. Okay? So last thing I want you guys to do is I actually want you to take 10 minutes based on your reading notes, based on lecture. I want you to answer these questions. And then afterwards, I want you to just click on this link and view this video on the slave trade. The video goes in detail, specifically looking at the conditions of the Middle Passage, as well as the long-term and short-term effects on Africa and the people of African descent. I think this video is important because it really hits this number 6. It talks about the social structure, that because of many men that were being moved or that were being taken as slaves, women had to go ahead and take on some of those roles. You're looking at a population that would decrease for generations as a result of the inability to mate, right? With a lot of societies now being run in Africa by females, you're not necessarily getting the just the mating as a result of that imbalance. All right. Um, so to sum it up, a couple things that you want to understand about how it affected structure in African society in the early modern era. One of the things you understand is that the rich got richer, right? The kingdoms that were involved in the selling of the prisoners of war, they obtained these manufactured goods from Europe, such as textiles, such as shells, such as guns, gunpowder, right? As a result, they got richer. As a result, one of the things you also want to look at is with them getting richer, you're getting the social impact of slavery, right? Slavery became, rather than more of just a, hey, we're going to war, we're going to sell our prisoners of war, it became a business, right? As a result of many of the smaller kingdoms with their males just being sent into the slave trade, you're getting a lot of famine. And the reason for this famine is specifically because in some societies it was the role of the men to work the crops, right? To go ahead and obtain those resources. And if women weren't trained, they definitely weren't able to access those resources. With that in mind, you're also getting a destruction of traditional cultures, right? Um, Lord Equiano, who was a slave, and he writes a narrative. One of the things that he talks about is that children, I mean, they could not go out by themselves as a result of the fear of being kidnapped, right? They could not go out and play. So one of the things that you're noticing is you're getting the destruction of a lot of traditional cultures simply because families were torn apart, as well as people not being able to engage freely because of the fear of increased warfare, as well as of the warlords that are in control that are continue getting richer. All right. If you guys have any questions, please let me know. But that is all I have for you guys today. And work on these DBQs. We'll go through those on Friday or Thursday. Sorry.